Hello, this is Tony Nicholls from Great Ideas. The purpose of this video is to demonstrate how to use the trellispark implementation from end to end to solve a specific problem. So one thing that came up recently in our testing is that we need to add a sales tax registration ID to our invoices. And at the moment, we aren't capturing the sales tax registration ID in the data model. So what we're going to do in this video is work through a complete end-to-end process of using the UX creator to update the data model. And then we're going to show how to actually pull that new information out of the data model into a REST API. And then finally, we're going to show how to display that information as part of the invoice document using Rxslt. So to get started, we've gone to our Great Ideas functionality. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at how do we want to add our sales tax information. So I'm going to start by looking at the form definitions within the functionality. And down here, I have an application for customers. So I'm going to use this customers application as a way of configuring both the countries in which we're going to do business and the sales taxes that we're going to collect. So let's start by going to the customers application. Now I'm going to be working with this customers application a lot. So the first thing I'm going to do is just bookmark this page for future use. You can now see I've got a bookmark to my customers form definition. So to begin with, I'm going to add a new tab definition to hold my configuration information. So I'm going to create this as tab 10 and the tab name will be configuration and then done. I'm just going to accept the default rows and fields. And so in my data model now, what I want to do is, if I show you customers first, right? So if I go and have a look at my customers form, then I don't have, a configuration tab here. Obviously, this is all test data. So in here, I'm going to go down now and I'm going to go back to my customers form. And I've added a tab for configuration. Now let's actually add some fields to this. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a new field definition on tab 10, which is my new configuration tab, row 1. On the left-hand side, I'm going to add a list of countries. And that list of countries is going to be a child list. So once I've filled in this basic information, if I save this, you'll see the subform information coming through. So because I selected child list here, then these additional fields become available down here. So what I'm going to be looking for is the Great Ideas. I want to see a list of countries. So I'm going to select the Great Ideas country type. And then that is done. So if I now save and clear the application state and go to customers, what I can see here is that I now have an extra tab called configuration, and here I have a list of countries. So obviously we're Canadian, so country Canada exists, and then in here I can add regions to Canada. So I already have Alberta and Ontario in as an examples. Okay, so that was a start, right? So what I need to do now is I need to actually add some sales taxes in here to configure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another field definition. And on tab 10, on row 1, this time on the right-hand side, I'm going to add sales taxes. And it's going to be a child list. Click Save to get my subform fields. So in here, I'm going to go and find Great Ideas sales taxes. Done. And if I clear my application state again, I can see I should now have countries and sales taxes. So if I go to configuration, I can see Canada and I can see sales taxes. So there's my Canadian sales tax for HST, and here's all of the sales tax rates. Okay, so this is looking good. Now my issue here is that the other thing that I'm going to want to be able to capture is the actual registration ID. So what I want to do now is I want to actually edit my sales tax form so that I can capture my registration GUID for this sales tax in this region. So let's go and have a look at how we're going to do that. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is go back to my UX Creator and go to Great Ideas, go back to Forms. I'm going to work down to my sales tax form. And because I'm going to work with this for a little bit, I'm going to just bookmark it. So now I've got a bookmark to my sales tax. And then if I go and have a look at my data model, here's my fields on my data model. So as you can see, I currently have my region, my name, and my rates. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to squish these up a little bit. So I'm going to move the region into just the left-right field here because I obviously don't have ones that span the whole width of the field. And I'm going to go in here and the name for the sales tax, and I'm going to squidge that down a little bit as well because I don't really need all of the space for the name. HST and GST and so on are just, short acronyms. So what I want to do now is I'm going to add a new field definition for the registration ID. So here I'm going to use the space I cleared out on the right to create a registration ID. And I'm just going to encode that registration ID as a string. And again, if I hit save, then I'll get my subform definitions. So here I'm going to put in the XML name that I want. So registration ID, and the data field is going to be not required. I could make them mandatory, but in this case I'm going to choose not to. Hit the done on this. And then here, if I go to my application state, and I go to my list of customers and my configuration, and I open up this, you can now see that I've moved these over, and I've got a space here for registration ID. So let me just put in a random registration code, and that's done. Okay, so now I have got my registration ID being set up and saved in the database. Okay, so that's a start. Now, I actually want to be able to use this on sales taxes. So again, if I go back to my UX Creator and I go to my Great Ideas and list of forms, and then down here, I actually have a concept that I've already created that's storing information about sales taxes. So at the moment, all I've really got is the sales tax and the amount. And what I want to do here is I want to add an extra field to this that's going to basically hold the registration ID. So here I'm just going to add a new field. So tab 1, row 2, and on the left this time we're going to create registration ID. Again, I'm going to save that. Oops, I'm going to first of all select my data type, save it, registration ID, and it's not going to be a mandatory field. Okay, so what I've now done is I've put a place to hold the registration ID on the sales taxes that I'm calculating. And what you'll see in a minute is, from the user experience perspective, where that information is being stored and captured and displayed. So now let's drill into this and have a little look at how this is actually going to work. So right now, if I go to my customers and I pull up my test customer. Okay, so let's go and have a look at how this works. So I'm going to go to customers. I need a test customer to play with. I'm going to bookmark this page as well. And now I can go into keys. I'm going to pick a random key here to actually use as my test key. And as you can see here, I have no applicable sales taxes on this license. So what we're going to do is we want to add the sales tax information in here. So here I'm going to go to my test customer. I'm going to bookmark my test customer. And as you can see, my test customer has got some applicable sales taxes selected for Ontario, which is good. So now if I go into my keys and I'm going to add a new license key, I'm going to need a random GUID. Now you can see it's not been able to render the document yet because we haven't generated the invoice information it needs. So here I pick usage tier and term. I'm going to actually tell it to generate a new key. Okay, so here then we've got the code working pretty much the way we expect it. We have our workspace GUID and our cost and sales tax being calculated, and you can see that we've got some Ontario sales tax coming in down here. So this is all looking good, and I have an invoice and I've got my sales tax and everything's been calculated, so this is all good. The only thing that's missing off this invoice is the actual registration GUID. So what I need to do is I need to basically include my sales tax registration information in the invoice details up here. So let's go and interrogate this information and see how we can make this work. So if I go into here and pull out the XML and then open up the XML document, you can see that we've got information coming in. So this is what we describe as the deep XML of the record. And while it's useful to be able to export data like this during development, I certainly wouldn't recommend that you had this available as an export during production. So this is good because it enables us to see the information that we've got to work with as we're formatting the Rxslt document here. So the first thing that we note here is that the sales taxes, we aren't seeing the registration information being copied down here. So what we're going to need to do now is go into the back-end code that actually calculates the sales tax to make sure that we now start to include the registration GUID. And then once we've included the registration GUID, then we can work through in terms of how do we actually change this document. So let's go into the underlying code. So this is the REST API that we use for Great Ideas to generate new keys. So what I'm going to do here is I want to work through my key generation so that I can add my sales tax information to the application. And the place that we're going to do that is in this add sales taxes code. So if I go here and go to the definition, okay, so this is the code that we need to have a look at here. So what we need to do here is we need to modify two particular things. As we get the sales tax rate, we're also going to want to make sure that we get the registration ID, and then as we add the tax line, we're going to want to pass in the registration GUID. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a couple of parameters here so that we can pull out the registration GUID. So let's start with the sales tax rate. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another out string registration ID. And obviously I'm going to want to add the registration GUID here. And I'm going to want to add it in here as well. Okay, so that one's fixed up the way we need it. And then on the tax line, we're going to want to pass in the registration GUID in here as well. So let's put another string on this. Registration ID in here. And then I'm going to want to pass the registration ID in here. Okay, so this bit was actually quite simple. Now what we need to do is collect the registration ID here from the tax table. So I've got a couple of pieces of code here. I've got the ZGI get sales tax rates, and then here I'm pulling in the tax information. So what I want to do here is take the registration GUID. Okay, so let's start by looking at the function that's going to get the sales tax rates. So the first thing I'm going to need to do is connect to my database and look at this underlying T-SQL to make sure I'm getting my registration ID. So let's start by connecting to my database. So at this point, we have made the changes to the user experience, and we can see that the default invoice has not got the sales tax registration code on it. So what we now need to do is make some changes to the back end to make this registration ID visible. So the first thing we're going to want to do is make some changes to the database. So if we look at the back end code, we see that the key of getting the registration GUID is this sales tax function here, where we're getting the sales tax rates for the Great Ideas website. And if we go and have a look at that code in the backend database, we can see that the key of getting the registration GUID is that we need to have this view here updated. Now this view obviously is not providing the registration GUID yet because we haven't updated it. We made a change to the underlying backend code, but that change has not yet been reflected in the actual underlying data model. So the first thing we want to do is regenerate the data model to preserve our registration GUID. So let's have a look at how we're going to do that. So I need to go back to my UX creator and my functionality, and I'm going to go to my functionality and tell it to generate SQL. And what this is going to do is it's going to generate a new attached file that contains the SQL script required to apply all of the changes into the user experience. And once this function has finished processing, I will see a new attached file here. So as you can see, I've got generate SQL client, and you can see this is today's time and timestamp. So if I go into this file here, you can see I can now download a copy of my SQL, and that is here. And if I open this code, so here if I go and have a look for changes to sales tax, you can see that I'm going to recreate my sales tax view, and it will now have a new registration ID tagged onto it. And down here on my sales taxes, you can see here that if I generate a lookup table for sales taxes, that it will also tag the registration GUID ID onto that as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to execute this code. So the updated script has now run. So if I go into my database and have a look at my views, and scroll down to my ZGI sales tax, we can now see that the registration ID field is being incorporated into that sales tax view. So there's the registration GUID on the tax one I created earlier. And if I go and have a look on my calculated sales taxes, again, I should now have a field for my registration IDs coming through. So there's my registration ID here, and we've got the registration now available from my sales tax information. So at this point, what we've done is we have modified the user experience to create fields for the registration ID, and we have regenerated the T-SQL that controls the views and the lookup tables and everything that's using the registration ID in the backend database. What we now need to do is finish off our changes into the web API to take advantage of this. So now if I go back to my ZGI sales tax rate stored procedure, what we can see is that we haven't added the registration ID here yet. So if I add the registration ID field here, so we know from our code that the get sales tax rates now needs to return, as well as the percentage and the unit cost, the actual registration ID. So let's get the registration ID out of the sales tax and return it here. So the easiest way to do this is to declare a new variable, registration ID as of our char 100 should be fine. And then we will capture the registration ID here. So registration ID was added to this view. And then we can return the registration ID as registration ID here. And so if I execute this change, I should now be adding the registration ID to the dataset returned by this function. And then the last thing that I want to do here is I am going to add the new function version into my T-SQL so that when I regenerate the SQL for the Great Ideas client as I migrate it between environments, I don't lose my changes. So at this point, we have modified the database. The views are now using our registration IDs, and we've modified the stored procedure that returns the sales tax rates to include the registration IDs. So all I need to do now is, once I've got these sales tax rates here, is I need to basically add them into my API sales. So what I will do is I will add a new string parameter up here. So found registration ID. We'll just initialize that to an empty string. And then here we will say that the registration ID is the found registration ID. And here we're going to extract the registration ID from the dataset that's being returned. So these are all X-element extension methods that we use to interrogate the results of the X-elements being passed back and forward. And in this particular case, this is basically extracting the string, the registration ID, from the dataset being returned, ultimately from this get sales tax rates. Okay, so we can now save and check these changes. Okay, so we now need to be passing our registration ID in here. So the registration ID goes in at the end, and we can pass it in here, and we should be good to go. Let's build this. Okay, so we've modified our code to collect the registration ID and to pass it into the add tax line. We have now gone to add tax line, and we are going to pass the registration ID into the sales tax line as we create the sales tax. And we have extracted it from the sales tax rates coming in here. And we have a good build. Okay, so I'm going to push these changes for testing. So obviously you can wire everything up and use the debugging to run through step debugging, or in my case it's just easier for me to use my automated deploy pipeline into my test environment just to push these changes to see whether they've worked or not. So I'm going to go back to my test license, and now if I have a look at my XML, what we see here is that the XML now contains our registration ID. So this is what we got before, and this is the updated version. So the registration ID is now being passed as part of the information associated with this registration key invoice. Okay, but it's still not being displayed here. So what I want to do now is I want to surface that registration ID on the invoice. So the way that works is that I need to change the document Rxslt that's being used to generate the invoice. So if I go back to my Great Ideas client and go down into my forms, I can find my license key information here. And if I look at my data model, you'll see I have a document down here. And this document is essentially going to render this invoice document template. And the invoice document template is essentially just displaying this information here. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at how we actually edit this Rxslt style sheet. So what I want to do now is I want to take this Rxslt style sheet, and I'm just going to copy this into an editor. So I'm just going to copy this style sheet into Visual Studio. So I like to use Visual Studio for editing these things, but obviously it's a personal preference. What I want to do now is I want to actually extract my registration IDs as part of my invoice details. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this the registration ID. And then I want to actually pull my registration data out. So if I go back and have a look at what my XML looks like, then obviously I'm reading from license key. My next hop is going to be children. And then from children, I'm looking for sales taxes. Looking at the instance data in the sales taxes. And I'm looking for the registration ID. So that should give me my sales tax registration ID in my Rxslt. So if I copy this back here, I can now see that my registration ID is encoded in here. So if I mark this as done, and then go back and tell it to clear my application state. So you can see that my registration ID has been added here. If I go back to my Great Ideas and tell it to clear the application state, I should now be able to go back to my test data, ask it to regenerate my invoice, and my registration ID field has appeared here, but the information has not come through. Let's click generate new key. There we go. Okay, so now we want to test that our Rxslt is working the way we're expecting. So if I go back to my test data set and I tell it to regenerate my invoice and I scroll down, you can see I've now got the field for the registration ID, which is containing the registration ID from my code. So let's quickly review what we've achieved in this demonstration. So the first thing we did was we went and added the registration ID fields to two new elements in the database. We went into the sales tax and we added registration ID here. We updated the sales taxes to include the registration ID there. We then regenerated the data model to include the registration ID in the underlying T-SQL. We then went into our code in the API and we made some changes that then enabled us to pick up the registration ID from our data model and copy it into our sales taxes. And then finally, we went in and we looked at how we would then pick up that registration ID as part of the Rxslt so that when we generate the invoice documentation, this new data appears on our invoice. So although there are many steps involved in this end-to-end change, you can see that each step is quite simple and easy to understand. This enables us to quickly make changes to our business solution to incorporate new functionality requirements.
To learn more about Great Ideas products and solutions, visit greatideas.com. That's Great Ideas with a Z.com. Thanks.